I would like to start out by asking about. Yeah, it's easy. It's easy to get lost in these nice leather couches, chairs. One of the really remarkable aspects of your work is that you pay such close attention to regional detail. And although your last 3 films have been set in the Pacific Northwest, your first film, River of Grass, takes place in Florida, where you grew up. Could you talk a little bit about what aspects of each region you've hoped to convey?
It's funny. I'm always asked about these places. It's not like a grand scheme or anything. It's more that I guess in figuring out the place, it's just sort of the way to start in figuring out the story and the characters and how they would move in the space and who they would be. So it's more, I guess, that I first figure out what I would do with the space and then start bringing the story into it. I start location scouting when we're first making drafts of the story of what we're going to write about, and then bring John Raymond photos from places, and or he knows places because he's in the last films. He's an Oregonian and he knows the specifics of the land. So we'll take some trips, or one of my producers and I for Meek's Cutoff went and camped out where the actual story took place, and it's just a way to start. And so everything sort of starts with location scouting even before we're starting to write, and so it kind of builds from there. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's so much that I have some specific thing I want to say about this place. It's one of the fun things to figure a place out, mm-hmm. and then it just sort of integrates itself. Mm-hmm. And
you mentioned John Raymond just a minute ago. How did your collaboration with him begin? He co-wrote Old Joy and Wendy and Lucy with you, and is credited as sole screenwriter for Meek's Cutoff.
It's been different every time. I met him because I had read his novel, The Half-Life, which I completely loved, and he was a friend of Todd Haynes, who has executive produced all these films. And after I read The Half-Life, I was just driving cross country, and I asked him if he had any short stories. And Old Joy had been something he had written to come out in a collection of photos for Justine Kurland. Mm-hmm. And I asked him if I could adapt it into a screenplay, and he was like, sure. So I went off and did that. And then with Wendy and Lucy, we came up with an outline together, and he started writing the short story. And then I started writing the script, and we were sort of just trading information back and forth. And if we come to a head, he keeps what he wants in the story, and I keep what I want in the screenplay. But he's definitely the one coming up with the voices and themes and structure. I'll work with the structure, but the voices are really start with him. And then on Meek's Cutoff, he had just finished a second novel, and he had just finished a book of shorts called Livability that came out last year. And he was just burnt on the short story. And so he just dove into writing the script, which was kind of harder for me, just because usually where I start is taking apart the story, and it's just a way to get started and get your head into it. And so it was a little trickier to approach something that already told you where scenes were starting and ending, and as opposed to just coming to that by myself. Mm-hmm. But then as I started scouting more and more in the places, figuring out the places where we would actually shoot, that sort of became where I could sort of, just do the last drafts before we shoot myself to work them in. Mm-hmm. Take what he's written and work it into what's actually going to happen. Because he's a really poetic writer, mm-hmm. and he's very just, one day rolls into the next, and which is what I love about it. But when you go to shoot, you can't you have to decide. And the idea, it's really like the idea that John has of just like, you're in the desert and you're walking the desert and you're surprised by, the immigrants are surprised by something. And then when I'm actually in the desert and I say, well, I'm, can see, into next week from where I'm standing, you can't really be surprised in the desert, then that all sort of starts to have to, I always say I like take the poetry out of his scripts because I just have to make it concrete. But all those things that are in his writing are ultimately what I want the film to come back to, because it's what's so, he just writes about space in such a great way, and sense of time in a way that's so beautiful. I mean, I don't know, I'm obviously attracted to his writing, and so I don't know, it's been different for us every time, and we just find our way depending on what's going on in our lives at that moment. And I should just say also, like when I'm cutting and he hasn't been there all through production, it's really great to be able to show him rough cuts and get notes from him, because he hasn't lived through all that we've been through, and he's like a good set of eyes for that. So the collaboration really sort of goes on.
Well, I'm curious to know more about your editing process, because you have worked as editor for your last 3 features. How do you work as an editor?
Slowly. But I don't know. I cut my first film with Larry Fessenden, and he really taught me a lot. He taught me really everything about editing. And I had this rule, sort of, no cut can happen unless I'm in the room. I want to know. And I realized, like, wow, it's really through cutting, you just figure out everything you would do when you're shooting. Like, oh. And so over the course of making my short films, I figured out, I just started practicing editing. And then by the time I made Old Joy, it's just too frustrating. I'm too, do this, not do that. It's just like, it doesn't really work to work with someone. I just want to sort of, after having been through production, it's very nice just to get the film back to yourself and close the door and be in a room by yourself with it and be able to go like, okay, what just happened? Where's my film? And so I sort of start, I always think of it, like I tell my students, I always feel like it's like I dragged a big log into the living room and I'm just going to whittle away until I find my movie in there. And so it's pretty private, nice. And there's never, these films are made for so little money. There's no rush, so it can take its time. And then I'll been showing stuff and seeing stuff with the same sort of handful of friends for the last 20 years now, where we give each other notes, and that's really helpful and great. And
Another important collaborator for you on your past 2 films is Michelle Williams, who's in Meek's Cutoff and in Wendy and Lucy. Can you talk about the director-actor relationship that the 2 of you have formed?
Yeah, well, it was very different on Meek's Cutoff than it was. Wendy and Lucy, it was just the 2 of us. We started shooting, it's like she got there and we started shooting, as is always the case, because I never really have anyone long enough to have a real rehearsal period. But I sent her books and images and things, I'm always sending her things to read and look at. If
I remember correctly, wasn't one of her assignments to look at Mouchette to prepare for Wendy and Lucy?
She saw part of Mouchette. It was really, for some reason, the Apu trilogy was, I can't remember exactly why, but I remember her watching that. And she'd never seen any Bresson at all. And Mouchette was playing up at Symphony Space. And I think she watched, I remember her watching Bleak Moments. And but then I give her things to read, and she likes anything, She just wants a lot of stuff. Like, give me a lot of stuff. Pictures, books, anything that's Marilyn Robinson, anything that's relevant, she wants. And then when we meet, it's time to start shooting. And one thing I think that was true in both cases, Michelle's a very cautious actor, and she likes to, we start working, and I feel like we're both finding the character. Like, I'm going through that adjustment of, what's been in your imagination, which, changes every day, to like, here's someone saying the words, this is it, this is what it, and I feel like it takes us both a while to figure out who the character is, and we're figuring it out as we go. And then there's that day where we're just like, oh yeah, okay, phew, there she is, and there's this feeling of relief. And but it's funny, when I'm cutting, I can't tell where that moment is exactly. And so I don't know, there's always this conversation that I mean, acting to me is just such a completely mysterious thing. It's not like, I don't, what actors do, why anyone would do it. I mean, I just don't have any bone in my body that would ever let myself be so out of control and in someone else's hands. I have no idea what they're thinking. But I do think that they're doing their thing, and I do think that there's a way to get across what you want to get across with the camera, and where you put the camera, and what lens you put on the camera, and how you move the camera, and that you're telling the story in that way also. And then the actors doing what they're doing for their part. And it's, I don't know, it's an interesting thing, because sometimes we'll come to a point and she'll be like, I can't believe you're going with that take. It, completely sucked. And I'm be like, no, that's the one. What are you talking about? And it's tricky, because it's really, it's hard to say. It's subjective, but it's also going to have to do with like what's on either side of it. And, there's so many ways to cut something, and I mean, there has to be something there, and there's always something there with Michelle for me, So I feel like there's a lot of options with her, and the main thing about Michelle is she's just so game to do stuff, and so anything physical, she's going to get to learn to fire a gun, a musket from 1845. She's in, or hop a train. You got her. She just wants to do. Yeah, she wants to do some. She just there's a scene in Meek's Cutoff where she's in a wagon and she's throwing furniture out of the wagon. It's really hard to stand up in those wagons, not to mention in that dress, and anything like that. Like, that's the stuff that makes her dive in. And she's a sport. So
many of your films also are very sly subversions of genre. And I'm thinking River of Grass is kind of a tweak of the Couple on the Lam movie. It's kind of an anti-Bonnie and Clyde. And I remember you once described Old Joy as a New Age Western. Wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
But then Todd Haynes told me never to say that again.
Oh.
And I always do what Todd tells me, because he's very smart.
Well, man. Perhaps you'd like to use another, this is your moment to use another term if you wish.
He really hated that phrase, summing up of it. Well, yeah. Well, the genre is like, that's a good place to start, right? Because it gives you a shape of something. And I teach, so I don't know, when you're teaching, you're kind of just deconstructing stuff all the time. That's how it goes, I think. I mean, I don't know, for me, that's how it goes. And it's so, yeah, I don't know. It's weird. They all end up being road movies, though, sort of, in the end, I guess, really. Yeah. They're all, in the end, people trying to go somewhere and not being able to go somewhere, which just is funny, because it's not really what you think. It's not what I think of when we're starting. But, yeah, I mean, with with River of Grass, I mean, I feel like in that one, it's the starkest, and I love a genre and I love a cliche, but it's the balancing act of being the cliche and being on the safe side of it. And I can't watch River of Grass, but when I know that I'm not on the safe side of it enough of the time in that film.
What do you mean by that?
I'm the cliche more than I meant to be, I would say. I was young. I remember after I made that movie, Film Forum was doing like a summer of 70s films, and they showed like 82 films from 1970 to 1979, of which I went to all of them. And Never even bought the membership pass, which was each day just figuring out how to pay to get into the film forum. But I just remember seeing Badlands again and really almost having to crawl out of the theater, just thinking like, oh my God, like, just my references were so bare and not, and so substandard. I don't know. A lot pains me about that film, but again, it was my first movie. It was my first narrative film.
It's a very impressive debut. You're being much too hard on yourself.
Oh.
So, should I bring up the New Age Western term again? Should we just...
New Age. I don't even know exactly what I meant, but I can't remember. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird to live through them, and I sort of feel like it's also not completely my job, unless it's your job. Like just to sum up my own films, you know what I mean?
Understood.
It's like hard to put them back in the box, even if you started
Sure.
somewhere with this idea of. I don't know what that movie is exactly. I'm not sure.
Well, then let's talk about Meek's Cutoff.
Okay.
Which is, you're working much more specifically within the template of the Western.
But I avoided that. I didn't use the word Western until I showed the film for the first time.
Right.
And that word was thrust upon me. I really tried to avoid it. And it's hard to avoid, obviously. But I tried to avoid it when we were making the film just to keep from getting boxed in. And also just, from the perspective of some of the actors who have been around longer and have been in a ton of movies, when you say Western, they are expecting you to go about it in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
And, if you drag people out to the desert for way under their rate and they have all the dialogue in the movie, they're not expecting that you're going to set the camera up way over there from someone else's and be on the listener the whole time. That's not really what they have in mind if you say Western. So I just felt really trapped by the idea of like Western, but it's a Western. I guess we can say
you're
that
really
now.
certainly expanding the definition of the genre.
Well, it's such a male genre to begin with,
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you get into it in the first place? It's so, everything about it is sort of not exactly what comes naturally to me. As far, it's about really heightened moments of action and heroic largesse and things that aren't really just not my thing, and it's really about mostly male confrontation kind of. So those aren't really any of the things we took on. So I thought of it more as I was, I was thinking, obviously this is not a fair reference because this film's like, of great importance. But, it was like Nanook of the North for me, more than, not that it was that, but just that was the way I wanted to think of it more than like the Western,
Well, no, that's a fascinating comparison because one of the many, the way that you leave your mark or you expand the idea of the Western is you really focus on, in a very detailed way, the arduousness of the domestic chores that people would have to do to survive. Like, how do you gather firewood and how do you make biscuits and stew and what time do you have to get up? And it's very similar to, I guess, is Nyla the name of Nanook's wife, how she has to chew the snowshoes to soften them up?
Yeah.
Can you talk more about, again, you're such a specific and detailed filmmaker. Was there a lot of research involved in the historical and period specifics in Meek's Cutoff?
It was. I felt like I was in 6th grade. I was such a bad student, but it was like American history, the pioneer. I don't know. I didn't know so much about it, but it was really fun to research. It was really, really, really interesting, and just I was just saying in the Q&A half an hour ago. Sorry if you were there. Just the diaries from the time were so expansive at the beginning of the journey, and just the way people talked about landscape and what they were going to and heaven on earth and their dreams and their ambitions and the other families, and as the journey goes on, like the writing just gets narrowed down to like lists, which were just like rocky road, crossed river 4 times, bad grass, or the women's diaries would just be, set up tent, built fire, whatever the chore, just like a chore list. Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting to me, just how minimalist it became and how hardcore. And that's really where we pick up in Meek's Cutoff. They've already been traveling for 6 months, and they're at the point where their diaries would just be list at that point. And I just thought, wow, that's really, like, you're really getting down mm-hmm. to it. And so that was, and then we had like a pioneer camp for the actors with some reenactment people, and for a week, they had a week of, building their tents and stocking their wagons and learning how to drive oxen and making fire without matches and building, at which we did this up at Bard where I teach too. We had like a pioneer test kitchen where we cooked some bread in the ground, and so we just, it became really great because it came research that really went into the art department, that really mm-hmm. went into the acting, and everybody sort of had to really into the wardrobe and and then our motels where we were just staying at, there's just one motel in town called the Horseshoe, and we all had our rooms, and it was like a sweatshop over in the, 2-person costume department, and they're hand sewing everything, and then that we used wagons from the period that had to be sort of stripped down, and the wheels were, we replaced some of the materials on the bottom of the wagons, but the wheels and the carriages were from the period. And so, there was like that labor. There was so much labor. It was so labor intensive getting ready for the shoot. It was incredible. But it just had this, that we were out in the desert, and it sometimes just looked so great to me mm-hmm. in that sense of just our labors.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm. Were there any Westerns that influenced or informed this film?
Sure. Well, I like the Western. I like, it's informed. I teach, so I am looking at stuff all the time, and it's hard to know anymore where stuff's leaking in from and where it's coming from. At this point. But I love Anthony Mann's Westerns, and William Wellman and Bud Bedecker and Nicholas Ray, and I've never seen the Ida Lupino. I know she did Westerns for mm-hmm. TV, and I haven't seen those, mm-hmm. but I'd be curious to. I'd be just so curious to see what those are. Sure, I like a Western.
Yeah.
There could be parts of stuff too you really like, and it's just some Western stuff is so hokey. I love McCabe and Mrs. Miller is maybe mm-hmm. an all-time favorite film. Mm-hmm. Hired Hand, Ride in the Whirlwind, anything with Warren Oates, probably, mm-hmm. But
anything with Barbara Stanwyck wearing
denim
and kerchiefs.
Yes. Yes. I remember when I first came to New York, it was pouring down rain one day, and I was in front of the Ziegfeld, and I went in there, and it was like, Barbara Stanwyck, double feature, like 2 Westerns. And I was like, oh my God, living in New York, this would be like every day. It was like, like the last great double feature at the Ziegfeld. I don't know. It's not an everyday occurrence. But, sure,
now I'm going to ask a more, not necessarily difficult, but convoluted question, perhaps. Right. But I'll try to make it not so convoluted. Your films often always have very subtle but yet unmistakable political allegories. Like in Old Joy, it's sort of a lament, I guess, and the hopelessness that people were feeling during the second term of George W. Bush. With, I believe you referred to Wendy and Lucy as a post-Katrina film, or certainly a film that was influenced by what was happening, or about human desperation and people helping each other or people not helping each other.
Right.
Without asking you to give away too much or to demystify Meek's Cutoff too much, would you like to talk about the political allegory in the film?
Not really.
Yes. No was a perfectly reasonable response.
Just because I always feel disappointed in myself when I hear myself talk about the films in that way. I mean, there's early discussions about how things are relevant and weird and seem timely, and but then in the end, I always, you try to get away from that and make the film you're making that's about whatever is in front of you, and what comes in, and what doesn't. And then I just always feel like I've summed something up in some moment way that I didn't mean to. I think, Meek's Cutoff, it's the myth, it's the American myth, and that mythology reworks itself all the time, and is, we started making the film when Bush was president, and we had all these ideas about it, and then when I showed the first cut to one of my colleagues, they were like, I get it. The Indians, Obama, I get it. And it's just like, yeah, like you can apply anything to it,
Yeah.
And so like why, and it just is what it is too of the period. I mean, Stephen Meek was a real man who led a real wagon train out west into the desert without really knowing what he was doing. And that actually happened. So, yeah, I always just think why do that?
Understood.
I'll leave it to the viewer or not,
Yeah. Okay. We would love to take questions from the audience. The question is about Kelly's collaboration with her sound designer, Leslie Schatz, and I guess collaboration with other members of her crew.
Right. Well, editing is pretty solitary, and I mean, on Final Cut or the Avid, you can really just build your sounds as you want them to be. I can't mix them, but I can certainly lay in what I want to be. And then he asked me about Leslie Schatz, our sound mixer, and then you go to Leslie and all the crappy sounds that you're, like, for example, in Wendy and Lucy, I just remember like searching, recording all these cars, and just trying to make this like car can't start sound, and just trying it, and take the spark plugs out, try to start the car, record it, and then Leslie, lays in the sound of a sewing machine, and it's perfect, or whatever. I mean, he just has great sounds and a great sense of. So he goes in and swaps stuff out and mixes, and the mixing is just like a huge part of it. But Leslie's expensive. I can't afford a lot of Leslie. When I go into Leslie's, like, it's not like when Todd Haynes or Gus Van Sant go in with Leslie and they spend a month with Leslie. Like, I got Leslie for a week, and I got to have my shit together and in place. Like, I don't have time for, like, expansive trying all kinds of different stuff there. So, and he works really fast. I mean, that's the thing. You turn around and it's mixed. It's weird. You're like, what just happened? So, and this last film was actually a bard. I had coming in at night. I would like clunk in my sounds or leave list of sounds. And it was actually a bard graduate that came in and did a lot of very obsessive sound, make my sounds better, basically, and add a little sound, and like he got really into it. And then, I was expecting Leslie to like swap a lot out, and he was like, oh, I was like, wait, that's our squeak, right? That my student found online. We're keeping that. He's like, it's a really good squeak. So, and with Old Joy, I should say, like in the hot tubs, it's true, it was very collaborative. That sound, when we recorded all the stuff in the hot tubs, which is like two guys alone in these hot springs, where we actually filmed, there was like a huge Russian family there speaking Russian for half the day, which was replaced by a huge Chinese family speaking Chinese for the rest of the day. And a bunch of like angry hippies, like, when are you getting out of that tub? And so there was not a quiet place. And Eric Offen and his partner who run Tandem Sound on 14th Street, they went out to their parents' house in Jersey and put these huge rocks in the bottom of their parents' pool and got up on, and then built this rock formation and then got up on their parents' roof and recorded themselves throwing buckets of water onto the rocks into the swimming pool in Jersey. And that's how we recreated the, and that was, so it's true that it does, the sound becomes really collaborative but you know, you can, the way you cut these days, you can do a lot on your own roughly while they can give you a sense of what you're doing so that you can just be, I mean, Wendy and Lucy, I cut in my apartment. So, you know, it's like, what am I going to do? Have a huge crew. And, you know, I if anything goes wrong, I don't know what to do. Like, I need a smart 22-year-old to come. I need them to get me completely set up. And I'm like, go away. It's not working. Come back. Okay, thanks. Go away. And so, you know, it's true that I need a lot of tech help. But it is a really, to me, it's the most private time aside from writing and scouting and starting to put the film together. Editing to me is like the real time you get to be alone with your movie. Well, that was great. It's Vicky Farrell, the costume designer, and Dave Dornberg, the production designer. It's great to have people that are that you can collaborate with at that point of it too. Just like they were such great researchers, and we went to all these places because we met like a lot of reenactment guys who are still like, these guys are in their 80s and they're still like, they take vacationers on Oregon Trail. Like, for your vacation, you're going to go spend a week as it was to be a pioneer on the Oregon Trail. And then we were always shifting between this thing, especially like with things having to do with the wagons of like, you know, we found the guy who has the real wagons and like, we want to use like the real guys. And it's like, but you're shooting a movie in the middle of nowhere with no backup. And, you know, really we should use the LA guys who are animal wranglers and know what goes on in movies. And, you know, and we constantly had this like romance for the real guy and the like practical side going, well, we really, you know, what are we going to do if something breaks with the real guy? You know, we got to have like LA guy, you know, and in the end, it turned out to be this in-between place where we, but it is, there's so many people that are obsessed with the period. This guy's whole business out that we met out in Oregon is people having their family wagons redone in the middle of a recession, no less. Like really you're not feeling the pain of the recession. People have the money to have their family's wagon from the 1800s rebuilt. I guess, you know, not everyone's feeling the sting, but it turned out, you know, to be this, that we just got so much from the people that are just so caught up in that period. And just like, wouldn't even know another world exists. And also, thank God having LA Wrangler guy there when the oxen break free and go charging through your set. You know, like this in-between place that we were always trying to balance. But, I mean, the best part of making a film is researching it. It really is. It's just the most fun thing, the scouting and the researching. It really is like the great, whatever anybody, to me, that's where the rewards are in that time. Everything is still possible, and you're just like getting all this information together, and it's so exciting, and you're figuring it out, and you're seeing new places, and you're learning about stuff you couldn't learn about otherwise because I just am a bad student, and it's, yeah, that's really the fun part.
Other questions? Jim? the question is to explain, I guess, the gender differences in the response to the Indian, to the other, essentially.
Others, yeah. Well, one thing that became really obvious in the journals, well, you read a lot of journals and then something hits you and you're just like, perhaps, one thing you sum up something because you get attached to it. Like I remember reading one woman say, "I'm keeping this journal should my husband ever care to get to know me." And like that, I was like, oh, wow. And you realize in reading the journals that you're in this constant state of community. There's no privacy, but it's totally lonely. And those bonnets, aside from being really dangerous because you have no peripheral vision when you are walking with oxen, and you can't really hear well through them. But they also, you don't have your whole scape of vision. It's really for the women, this honing in of, it really narrows the scope. You see what's right in front of you. And so you read the journals and you really realize that everyone is so busy and so drained and so at the point we catch up with them on the journey, it just seemed like every word that came out of their mouth, I just really try to constantly talk the actors out of, can we just take that line away? Because I just don't even think they could even say it. Who cares? It's just they can't even, so sick of each other, right? Just who could even talk? But the friendship you realize the friendship and the love it becomes with the women. And that's how they're really making it, is because the women are forging these friendships with each other. And I did want that to come through because that seemed throughout so much of the men's writing is there's second guessing in politics and who's, they set out in these big groups and they make laws for each other and they set a captain, who's the captain of the wagon train and who's going to be the pilot. And they set out, the men go and they agree on the laws of the trip. And then as they get further along, they start breaking off into smaller and smaller groups. Correct me if I'm wrong, from what I understand. Just because, just walking behind, the dust, I think the trail was something like 10 miles long by 1850 because nobody wants to be in the back. They say devil take the hindmost. And so, and also there just aren't the resources when they get to camp. There's not enough grass or water. And then you're waiting. Someone's wagon's always broken and you're waiting for the Joneses so the groups became smaller and smaller as they went out west. And I think, there's a real difference there. There's just such a difference in the male diaries than the women's diaries. The voices were really different, and friendship, in the hardship of leaving people behind when you went. You just left family and friends and everything you knew. I mean, I just really just constantly wondered, would I have gone west? Would I have done it? I mean, home would seem so unsatisfying if you just saw a bunch of people going, right? Look at them, where are they going? And then, but yet going, you just to go into the unknown. I'm not you really. I think religion is a big part of it. This thing that would drive you to this heaven on earth at the other coast, But just that thing, how you could survive losing children, losing loved ones along the way, leaving everyone behind. I think that comes through in the women's diaries are just this deep friendships that evolved. And so, and on just being on the outskirts of the activity all the time of, when things are being decided and getting your moment to wield your power in the privacy of your tent with your husband or finding out the information through your friend. Did your friend's husband say anything? Did you hear anything? That's a lot of that's made up. I mean, I don't, it's hard to know how, there were these books at the time that were sort of romance novels, I think, that were very much about, like Big Fear was like you'd go out and you'd be raped by the savages, but it's all written like really sexy, like, and you were so like that was so the least of your worries at that point, especially 1845, I think, and a lot of Native Americans are how people got safely to where they were going, and but there. You do read, there is definitely suspicion and racism, and I mean, we're a racist country. It was racist, and just, just otherness and fear of otherness. I mean, you can imagine those clothes, everyone's so sewn up all the time. The pajamas are so sewn up, like there's so much clothing, and then it must be so odd to come across someone so naked and bareback and, right?
Other questions? Yes, sir. The question is how many people actually survived and how many did not?
It's impossible to clarify because everyone's account is so different. But the party didn't stay together. The Tethero party was a true party that was a break-off of the other parties. But, I mean, our story is such a hodgepodge of diaries and made-up things. In the Meek story, it's, nothing to be followed. But in the true Meek story, some people write that 23 people died, and then when this missionary Black Moses finally found them and brought them food, that another 50 people died from, they ate so quickly and so much food that they didn't make it after that. But the number varies no matter what you're reading. And as I said in the Q&A, if you read Stephen Meek's account, everybody made it through just fine. So it really is hard to know. I think, people were traveling so far apart and in different cliques, there was just different information, I guess. The area where we shot, there are 3 graves of 3 little girls out there where we were. But I don't really know the absolute real number. About the editing taking shape. Well, it's funny, I was talking to Todd Haynes about it last night, and I kind of forgot this. I started cutting in Portland, and then I finished in New York. But I always do like a huge assembly first, like exactly how it's supposed to be, and it's giant. And then I got really freaked out, and I cut just a ton of stuff out. And then it was weird, a thing of like, instead of whittling away, of putting stuff back in slowly as I went, which was an odd way at it. But I had never really worked with 9 performers before. And that was really, it was just so fun cutting scenes with, just trying to figure out a scene like at the petroglyph camp where there's 9 of them and they're scampering all around. And just certain discoveries in those moments that are different from how I would teach, where I would try to figure out all the eye lines of the 9 people, and then you start cutting and you go like, oh, it's a gang. There are no eye lines. It doesn't matter. Phew, I can just cut this however I want. Things like that, or just it still amazes me what space does to a performance. How if you just add time on the either side of something and draw something out, how different the meaning of how somebody's getting something across is. And things like that are just, that's what's great about editing. Like, there's just discoveries every day. You go like, wow, that's how that works. That's so great. But I cut it for like 6. I teach too, so like I'm teaching 2 days a week and cutting 5 days a week, so it gets slower and I can't. It's a long process, and I can't remember like all my eureka moments, but I don't know. That is the thing of it, is that you're like discovering little things and how you can manipulate them, and how you can a performance that maybe in the beginning you just didn't know how it would. The whole time we were shooting, like Shirley Henderson, for example, is an actress who every time she's in front of the camera, you just feel like everything else seems fake, right? You're just like, oh my God, oh, like, geez. And Meek is so big, and he was in real life. Everybody writes about what a, like, showman he was. He was big and brassy, and, and that's how Bruce played him. But sometimes you're working with Shirley, and then Meek enters the frame, and you're like, how is it ever going to be the same movie? Like, that was sort of my panic when I was shooting. I was like, how is Shirley Henderson in the same movie that Bruce Greenwood's? Like, how's this tone ever going to come together? Mrs. White and Meek, like, can that be in the same world? And, and then in editing, you can figure that out. And actually, Leslie Schatz really helped me too, because he, like, mixing really helps out also. Just like, he had this idea of, like, taking some of the bass out of one voice and moving, and just bringing them into a world together so that everybody's acting style is, like, working together. And I don't know if that really answers your question. They were really stinky, the actors, I want to tell you. Michelle just kept saying that. I stink. I was excellent.
Was there an odor wrangler on set?
There was, well, it's funny, Michelle's finger you mentioned. I'm so happy for her finger. She somehow has managed to stick the same finger into a blender twice. Been taken to the hospital twice for sticking the same finger into a blender. I'm like, how do you do that? But that finger is so mangled. It was so fun to, like, have it so dirty and be able to shoot it. It looked like, yeah. But it's so dirty out there. Like, we were just all, to get to where we were going, you're driving off-road in these cheap, like, cargo vans, right, that, like, you rent. And my producers get completely blacklisted from every rental place in Oregon. I mean, the wagons held up through everything, I have to say. In every car, truck, everything else broke constantly. But, like, the dust is so fine, it's just coming through the doors and coming through the air conditioner, and everybody has a bandana on in the van. I kept thinking of those scenes in Billy Jack when they go in the diner and the flour gets poured over the kid's head. Like, that's what we all look like. Everyone was just so dirty. And yeah, it was, and everyone just, the crew was dirty, the actors were dirty, and we let them wash. Vicky finally washed their clothes once because they were just complaining of how bad they smelled. And so there was one day when their clothes were dirty, washed and then fake dirtied. And, but other than that, it's just pretty dirty out there.
The question is, how does Kelly know when still is too still?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it's funny, seeing the film last night, like, I've never seen it that huge before. And I have just such a crappy editing system. Like, I'm editing, it's like this big. It's not big enough. And then you make an editing choice that you are good, seeing it, like, stuff, things could be tweaked. Like, you're seeing it that huge, you're like, that time's different when it's that big than when it's smaller. And so that in and of itself, when we're shooting, we knew we were going to be doing these chores, and so I would film the chores pretty much happening, build the fire, knead the bread, whatever it is. And we were just constantly having to start, you got to start a shot with, like, a fresh reel, and you have all these short ends that you're trying to get to, but that we can never get to because there's just the shots. I don't do a lot of takes, but the shots are long. And so that I can decide later how still is too still, And but I guess that's kind of the experiment part of it, is this idea of, if you take something like the Western that's based on action and you apply, like, a Chantal Ackerman approach to it of expanding real moments, could that expansion of time somehow equal action again, in the way that instead of, like, boom, a gunshot, would work? Could you somehow get tension in this expanse of a moment instead of the expanse sort of just, usually, I mean, silence is usually setting you up for action or taking you down from action. And could it sort of work the other way where the still moment is, like I'm thinking right now of that, what's the O'Fools film, with James Mason
The Reckless Moment?
The Reckless Moment, where the whole soundtrack is just, she's like the 50s housewife, and the whole soundtrack is like the nagging kids and mom, blah, blah, blah. Hello, Mrs. Wilson, the town, everybody's friendly and talking, and then, and music, and then she sees the dead body on the beach, and it just becomes silence, and it's just the wind, and then she ditching the dead body, and it's just the wind and a little bit of wave sound and a little putt-putt motor. And the whole time she's ditching the body, it just goes quiet and like everything stops. And just a woman and a body in a boat in the wind. And then she gets back home and the mundane of her life starts and all the noise and the action starts again. But it's like a reverse of that moment. Instead of being the heightened moment, is like dumping a body is the most peaceful moment in her life. Like, finally, I'm away from the kids. I got to go dump this body, and that works in this other way, And so that was sort of the experimental thing of trying to, use silence in a setup that's usually about confrontation and more make it just about, trance and monotony without, making the audience fall asleep, I guess.
The question is, how does Kelly approach having a character who speaks a language that the characters don't understand and that most of the audience won't understand? The flip side of that being, for those who do understand the character, what considerations play into effect?
Right. Well, I'm concerned about it because he's speaking Nez Perce, and the actor Rod Radeau, who plays the Indian in Meek's Cutoff, he's Crow himself, and he speaks when we met him, he spoke 5 Native American languages, and he learned Nez Perce for this part. And he went to Pendleton, where he plays a Cayuse Indian, which I guess the Cayuse language is dead, and they were usurped by the Nez Perce and adopted that language. And I think there's very few people that still speak Nez Perce. So we send him to a place where they to learn the dialogue, and they recorded it for him on tape, but they wouldn't write it down. And so it was never written down, and I'm editing it without anything to look at. So I'm way more afraid of the people that know the language seeing the film and me having slaughtered it in the editing, because it's a really hard language, and it was just so difficult. I said before, I have a great souvenir of that I found in the desert, speaking of a Georgia O'Keeffe moment, of a cow hip bone where Rod, the actor, had written phonetically all his lines on this cow bone that I have. But it's so it's about 8 people that are going to be really pissed if I did it, if slaughtered it. But also I could get in trouble because they wouldn't give him a death prayer of which he sings in the film, because that's very, I guess, private and personal. And they were like, you can sing your own Crow death prayer, you're not getting ours. And he did, and I didn't know what it was going to be till he did it in that moment. So that's probably a little, I don't know, funky to some people for sure. But the idea was that the audience would always be in the perspective of the white immigrants. And so that point of view is, and I don't know if that really answers your question. I don't know. But I'm sure the language is screwed up in the editing. There's no way I got it completely right. But Rod probably got it pretty right, because he really has just a great ear for language.
Other questions? Yes.
I will say this about the language, just the Cayuse. There's this, my a student of mine that was doing some research for us found we were trying to find any remaining Cayuse, and the last living guy I think that speaks Cayuse, he found him on YouTube, and we played it, and he does this long prayer in Cayuse. You're like, what? You don't have any idea what it's about, and you're just watching it, and it's really, he's in his chair in the yard, and he's doing, and then the translator, after it's all over, translate it, and she says, we pray that all the filmmakers make honest films, and it's a prayer to filmmakers. And it's so weird. It's just so bizarre.
Yes.
That's was a true part of the story. They found gold, and there's been a lot written about. It's called the Blue Bucket. Blue Bucket Gold is like, and it's always referred to as. And there were a lot of people that went back and tried to retrace the Meek wagon steps to find the gold. And a big hit was never really found. But part of the myth of the Meek story is that people did claim that they had found gold at this particular spot, but they just didn't have the energy at that point. They were like 25 hours without water. They just didn't have the energy to do anything about it. Yeah. He asked me how poor I am. Very. Well, we always say, like, we took less money than we could have possibly taken for this movie because we are, like, the parameters are like, you if you put in money, you can't come to set, you can't final cut. Like, it's just so, you have to be so hands off. That's not very appealing to most people. And so we've made these films for really small amounts of money. I would say on this one, we stretched ourselves further than, I mean, it was nutty, right? I mean, like, it was, well, you know, I mean, if you stayed in a motel and you had what you had, whether you were doing craft service or whether you were the star of the movie, you got everyone. It was a very level playing field, and which is interesting in film. But it is, I mean, I don't really have a foot in the commercial world. I teach for a living, and we always say, like, that we just try to think of it like we're going off to do it with our friends, to do an art project. And we want to have room to fail, and we want to have room to have it not work out and not have anybody's life be over, or career be over, anything like that. And I don't really know how, I've never made money off film at all. I got paid for the first time ever on this film, and I made minimum wage for the first time for shooting. You know, I mean, I don't know how you get money and keep complete hands off. I don't know how you do that. On the other hand, you know, I'm no spring chicken. It gets harder. It's harder. It's physically hard, and it's hard to keep putting people through it, you know. I mean, like, everyone's game once, but not everyone's game once, but some people are. But, like, it's hard. I don't know. The thing that I find the most challenging about it, actually, is that when you're shooting, there's no money for anything. You got to watch every foot of film you're shooting. And, which, okay, so you have to be careful. But, you know, like, you can't, the sun sets early, you don't make your day, you can't make it up. You just can't have it. There's just not enough time. There's no bending. There's no money. You're going to edit in the shittiest editing room or in your apartment. There's nothing, no frills. But then, like, later, there seems to be, like, more wiggle room for, like, I don't know, there's things, like, I don't know, it's too complicated to get into. Just, you know, like, getting your actors to a festival the way they need to get there, and, or, you know, because now you're back in real life. And, or, like, feeding your, you know, a party after your film screens at New York Film Festival. You know, like, I'm just like, I'm so cheap now. I'm just like, where's that? Who's, like, everyone's got their celebratory plate of food. I'm like, who's paying for that? Where's that money coming from? God damn it. You know, like, I can't, like, separate it. I'm like, I am just like, what? Where do we get this hotel room now? Huh? How's this possible? You know, like, where was this cash when I was in the desert, you know, and needed the rattlesnake kit that we couldn't afford to save a life? You know, like, that is the hardest thing for me to get my head around, that it takes one certain amount of money to get a film out that is a different playing field than the amount of money you have when you're making a film. And it's complicated, but that, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying. It's complicated. I don't know. I will say that I don't see I don't see a ton of women. I don't see any women in America making personal films that they want to make and making a living off of it the way I might see, you know, like, I don't know what a female equivalent to a Spike Jonze is, or a Noah Baumbach, or a Todd Haynes, or a Gus Van Sant, or I could go on and on. Love those guys. I don't know what the female equivalent is for that. And, but fortunately, I like my teaching gig, so that's nice, right? And I really think it takes a different skill set than I actually have to work inside the industry. Like, I learned kind of young that I just don't really have those talents, personality-wise. And so my little group that I'm making my films with does not provide any financial security, but it is a safe little way to go out and make a movie and have complete as much creative control as you can afford, which isn't complete creative control, obviously, but as much as you can afford. And I will also say that I won't say this if I think my producers aren't here, so I'll say this. That I think mostly in some weird way, no, it's shooting myself in the foot to say this. I usually say, like, my limits have worked for me to some degree aesthetically. Like, a lot of filmmakers just wouldn't work for their aesthetic to have the limits that I've had. But I'm not tired, I'll tell you that. You know, and whatever, I would like a nice plushy bathrobe and slippers sometimes in the big room, in the, you know, whatever. It's, you know, I feel lucky to have made these films. And I teach up at Bard, and I feel lucky to have that gig. So, but I'm not opposed to getting paid for making a movie at some point before I hit 50. Yes, Oscilloscope, who put out Wendy and Lucy, is going to put the movie out in, I think not till next spring, but yeah, it's very nice. I think maybe May or June. I don't really know what the plan is. We just sold the movie, and yeah, and we have some distributors around the world, which is nice. Yeah, I think it'll make its little way out, which will be great. So I'm happy you all saw it now, and I really appreciate you coming, and thanks a lot. And thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, for your fantastic film.
Thank you for being here.